The room didn't go quiet all at once. It happened in layers. First, the laughter dipped. Then the music seemed to thin out, like someone had quietly turned down the bass. Conversations started breaking mid-sentence. Heads tilted, eyes tracked in the same direction, not because someone had raised their voice, but because someone hadn't needed to. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And that's when the question allegedly landed. Why are you here? Not shouted, not announced, just delivered with enough calm authority that it didn't need volume to cut. The kind of sentence that doesn't echo, but lingers. The kind of sentence that rearranges the emotional temperature of a room. Now let me ask you something right out of the gate. Have you ever been somewhere you technically had access to, but instantly felt you didn't belong? Not because anyone tackled you or dragged you out, but because the air itself changed? Because the smiles froze just a half-second too long? Because suddenly you were very aware of where you were standing? That's the kind of moment we're talking about. Because what allegedly happened inside the Billboard Power 100 event at Zouk Los Angeles wasn't a screaming match. It wasn't a viral meltdown caught on shaky phone footage. It was far more uncomfortable than that. It was quiet power colliding with perceived entitlement. And depending on who you believe, it ended with security being summoned and one of the most talked about women in the world being escorted out of a room she was never meant to dominate. But here's the thing. This story isn't really about a pop icon calling security. And it's not just about a duchess showing up where she maybe wasn't wanted. It's about hierarchy. It's about how Hollywood actually works when the cameras aren't pointed at the door. It's about who controls space, who controls access, and who gets to ask that one devastating question without ever being challenged. Why are you here? Let's rewind for a moment. The Billboard Power 100 event is not a red carpet circus. It's not about selfies, fanfare, or trending outfits. It's an industry gathering, a power map, a room where the people who decide careers, budgets, airplay, and relevance quietly take stock of one another. You don't just attend this kind of event. You are invited with intention. Every name on the list is there for a reason, and every reason is known by the people who matter. Which brings us to the first uncomfortable contradiction. On paper, almost anyone with enough status can find their way into a Hollywood event. But in reality, there's a sharp difference between being allowed in and being wanted there. Hollywood has doors, yes, but it also has thresholds. Invisible lines that separate insiders from guests, guests from observers, and observers from liabilities. And according to multiple accounts, Meghan Markle's presence that night landed squarely in that uncomfortable gray zone. Some attendees later described it as confusion, others as irritation. One industry insider allegedly said it felt like someone had walked into the wrong meeting. Not offensively, just incorrectly. As if the room had been set for one conversation, and suddenly a different narrative walked in wearing confidence that hadn't been earned there. Now pause with me for a second. Ask yourself this. In a room full of executives, artists, and power brokers who've spent decades building influence, what does celebrity without leverage look like? Because that's where this story starts to get uncomfortable. Mariah Carey is not just famous. She is institutionally powerful. Her career isn't built on borrowed relevance or proximity to royalty. It's built on charts, contracts, longevity, and an unspoken understanding that when she occupies space, that space adjusts around her. She doesn't chase rooms. Rooms adapt. And that matters. Because when someone like that allegedly notices a disruption, it doesn't play out like a scene from reality TV. There's no need for confrontation. No need for escalation. The machinery of the room simply responds. Several attendees later described the same sequence, though none wanted their names attached. A glance. A pause. A quiet word to someone who already knew what to do. And then, allegedly, the sentence. Why are you here? Here's where the tension sharpens. Because depending on who you ask, that question wasn't meant to humiliate. It wasn't even meant to be public. It was meant to establish boundaries, to clarify purpose, to restore the original function of the space. But intent doesn't erase impact. And impact is what ripples. Witnesses claim Meghan appeared momentarily stunned. Not angry, not embarrassed, just caught off balance in a way that's rare for someone used to commanding attention. One source described it as the look you get when you realize the rules you thought applied don't. And that's when security enters the narrative. Not rushing in, not storming the scene, but moving with that unmistakable efficiency that says instructions have been received. Quietly. From someone whose authority doesn't need to be explained. Now here's the question the internet immediately asked once whispers of this incident began circulating. Why would security remove her at all? And that's where this story becomes less about one moment and more about a pattern. Because removal doesn't always mean ejection. Sometimes it means redirection. Sometimes it means an escort that feels polite on the surface but communicates something far harsher underneath. You don't belong in this room. And that message, once delivered, cannot be undone. What makes this even more striking is what didn't happen next. There was no public defense. No loud ally stepping in to reframe the situation. No influential voice saying, "She's with me." The silence was immediate. And in Hollywood, silence is rarely neutral. It's a verdict. Within hours, damage control allegedly began. Subtle narratives floated. Vague denials. Carefully worded statements that avoided specifics. Because specifics are dangerous when too many people saw the same thing from different angles. But here's the part no one expected. This incident, according to insiders, didn't start at the moment security moved. It started earlier. Much earlier. With whispers about access. With questions about invitation status. With discomfort that had been building before anyone said a word. And that means the sentence, "Why are you here?" wasn't spontaneous. It was the final act of attention that had been simmering all night. So now let me ask you something. If this was just a misunderstanding, why has no one fully shut it down? If nothing happened, why are so many people being careful with their words? And if this was simply a social hiccup, why did it leave such a deep impression on the people in that room? Because what came next wasn't public outrage. It was something far more damaging. Quiet recalibration. Invitations that don't arrive. Conversations that end sooner than they used to. Doors that open a little slower, if at all. Hollywood doesn't punish loudly. It remembers. And in the chapters ahead, we're going to walk through exactly how that memory works. Who noticed? Who stayed silent? Who benefited? And why one seemingly simple question may have marked a turning point no PR team can fully erase. But before we get there, you need to understand the room itself. Because the truth is, no one walks into a space like that by accident. And once you understand how that room operates, everything that followed will make a lot more sense. But what happened next inside that room changed the entire tone of the night. And the people who witnessed it say the warning signs were there long before anyone called security. You don't stumble into a room like that. That's the first thing every insider agrees on. No wrong turn. No casual +1 situation. No. I was just nearby and decided to pop in. Rooms like the Billboard Power 100 event at Zouk Los Angeles are designed to repel randomness. They are engineered, curated, filtered. Every person inside has been accounted for long before the doors open. So when people later said, it felt like something was off, they weren't talking about vibes. They were talking about protocol. Let me put you inside that space. This wasn't a red carpet screaming with paparazzi. No velvet ropes begging for selfies. The lighting was deliberate. Dim, but not dark. Warm, but controlled. The music wasn't there to entertain. It was there to set tempo. Conversations weren't loud. They were measured. People leaned in. Names were dropped sparingly, because everyone already knew who mattered. This was a room of decision-makers pretending to relax. Executives who decide which artists get pushed. Managers who decide who gets dropped. Icons who don't need to explain why they're there because the room exists partly because of them. In spaces like this, attention is currency and silence is leverage. And here's the rule most outsiders never understand. You don't announce yourself in rooms like this. You are announced by your relevance. That relevance can come from numbers, power, longevity, or control. Sometimes all four. But it never comes from optics alone. That's why the first few minutes of Meghan Markle's presence reportedly raised eyebrows. Not because she walked in dramatically. Quite the opposite. According to multiple witnesses, her arrival was noticeable in its subtlety. No entourage flooding the space. No loud greetings. Just enough confidence to suggest she expected to be there. And that expectation is what triggered the quiet discomfort. One industry guest later described it like this. It felt like someone had shown up to a board meeting thinking it was a networking brunch. Now ask yourself this. In a room full of people who have clawed their way to influence, how is expectation received when it isn't backed by authority? Not well. Here's where the misunderstanding begins for a lot of people watching this story from the outside. Fame and power are not the same thing. In fact, in rooms like this, fame without control can be a liability. It attracts attention that doesn't convert into outcomes. It disrupts focus. It shifts the center of gravity away from the people who are actually running things. And the Billboard Power 100 event is all about gravity. Who pulls it? Who resists it? Who gets bent by it? Several attendees later said they noticed subtle signals almost immediately. A pause in conversation when Meghan approached certain clusters. Smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. Polite nods without follow-up. People acknowledging her presence without anchoring it. That's not warmth. That's assessment. Hollywood doesn't reject instantly. It evaluates. And while this was happening, something else was unfolding beneath the surface. Staff were already alert. Not panicked. Alert. Because staff in rooms like this are trained to sense disruption before it becomes visible. They watch body language. They watch who gets approached and who doesn't. They watch who gets absorbed into conversations and who floats. Floating is dangerous. Floating means no one has claimed you. And in these spaces, being unclaimed is worse than being disliked. Now here's the part that matters more than any headline. According to insiders, there was confusion over invitation channels. Not loud confusion. Quiet confusion, the kind that travels through earpieces and side glances. Who approved this? Who's she with? Is she expected? Those questions don't need answers immediately. They just need to exist. Because once they exist, the clock starts ticking. And while all this is happening, Mariah Carey is already inside the room. Not surveying it. Not scanning for attention. She doesn't need to. The room calibrates around her automatically. People adjust posture when she's nearby. Conversations tighten. Laughter becomes measured. She is not the loudest presence, but she is the most anchored. And that distinction is everything. Anchored people don't get questioned. They question. Now let's slow this down, because this is where the narrative usually gets flattened into gossip, and that misses the point. There was no explosion. No dramatic confrontation at first. What witnesses describe is far more unsettling. A gradual narrowing. A sense that the room was gently, inexorably correcting itself. People repositioned. Circles closed. Conversations that had been open became inward-facing. Meghan, according to one account, attempted to engage, to place herself into the flow. But flow doesn't accept force. It accepts alignment. And alignment, in this case, wasn't happening. One veteran publicist allegedly leaned toward a colleague and whispered something that would later feel prophetic. This isn't her room. That sentence alone tells you everything about how these spaces function. Rooms have owners, even when no one's name is on the lease. Now imagine realizing, in real time, that you're standing in a space where your presence is being silently debated. No one is rude. No one is overtly hostile. But the room is no longer neutral. And here's where the tension begins to crystallize. Because when a room like this encounters uncertainty, it looks to its most powerful anchor for direction. And Mariah Carey doesn't do chaos. She does clarity. Witnesses describe a moment where her attention shifts. Not dramatically, not sharply, just enough that the people closest to her register it. A look, a pause, a subtle break in rhythm. That's when the atmosphere changes. Not because she spoke loudly, but because the room sensed that a decision was about to be made. And this is the part people don't like to talk about. Power doesn't always need justification. Sometimes it just needs acknowledgement. Which brings us to the moment right before the alleged question was asked. The room had already decided something wasn't right. It just hadn't been articulated yet. Staff were on alert. Guests were watching. Conversations had thinned. The space was holding its breath. And then, according to those present, the boundary was finally verbalized. But before we get to the words themselves, you need to understand what those words meant in that context. Because, "Why are you here?" doesn't land the same way everywhere. In some rooms, it's rude. In rooms like this, it's definitive. It's not a question. It's a sorting mechanism. And once that mechanism is activated, everything that follows becomes procedural. But what happened in the seconds after that question was allegedly spoken would set off a chain reaction no one in the room expected. And it would turn a quiet recalibration into something far more visible.